Chuck, welcome back to This Is Horror.
Michael and Bob, thank you for asking me back.
Yeah, it is an absolute pleasure. And the last time that we spoke was actually around this time last year for Not Forever, but for Now. So, as I often do, I want to know what some of the biggest changes for you or impactful events have been in the past year.
In the past year, uh, this is going to sound terrible, but a friend introduced me to psychedelic mushrooms, and I find that for the first time, I can write very serious, but I can also write funny when I want to be funny. But I'm not always thrown to being automatically funny or sardonic. That I found with shock induction, I could actually write an emotional scene where characters were hurt and empathetic and sympathetic without just kind of batting away those emotions. And so, yeah, mushrooms make all the difference.
That is a really interesting contrast to the opener the last time that we spoke, because you said you were off alcohol last time, and this time you're beginning with I'm on mushrooms.
And I am off alcohol. I found that alcohol was another sort of thing that I was using to kind of deny or evade any kind of emotional connection. And mushrooms seem to really allow for an emotional connection that I really haven't had for a long time.
I
I'm not on
kind
mushrooms right now. Okay,
Yeah,
let's just say
yeah,
that.
just to clarify. But I almost find it difficult to believe. It's like you've just been introduced to mushrooms. It's like, at this point.
I took them in college, and in college, it was just this kind of random fistful of mushrooms that you took with your friends at the beach. And it was just so hard to understand the dosage or the effect. And at a time when my brain was really not as sort of finished as it is now. But recently, they're legal in Washington State, at least in the form of gummies. And I find that they kind of deliver me to that manic phase, that manic state for a few hours when I seem to do my best work. I can really hypnotize myself, psych myself into a character, and write from within that character in a very effective way for really 2 or 3 hours.
Hmm. So that makes a lot of sense because I always feel like that alcohol, they say, it allows you to be more inhibited, but I always felt like it allows you to be more closed minded. Whereas if you go into mushrooms or psychedelics, then you get an expansion of yourself and a connection with the world around you that alcohol doesn't give you.
I would, as a vulnerability where alcohol just seemed to sort of be an armor, be a kind
Right.
of warding off any kind of vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. And then, but then you have like you really what I call sad drunks. The people who you get drunk and all they want to do is cry and commiserate over the regrets of their life and things like that. And you just want to give them a big hug and go, "Oh man, it's going to be okay." You know.
But what you're talking about is a kind of connection with your own emotions as opposed to an empathetic connection with other people's emotions or a
Right.
character's emotions.
Mm-hmm.
So alcohol puts you in touch with your own unhappiness, but it
Right.
doesn't do much to connect you to other people.
Yeah. Now I want to try psychedelics again, but hey, I'm in Texas. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
Okay. I'll send you some.
But I mean, I would imagine too that, now the types of psychedelics that you can get a hold of are going to be of a much better quality than, let's say, 20 years ago, where, particularly in the UK, you just have to go down to Camden and find some guy. And, now, like, you look at things like mainstream outlets like Tim Ferriss's podcast, and they're all about psilocybin and expanding the mind. And so I just imagine what you're getting. It's of a higher quality, and it's going to, as you say, you can control that dosage more too.
And at the same time, I'm very wary. I want to keep flowers for Algernon in mind, and try to make sure I'm not destroying my mind as I'm kind of heightening my ability in these brief periods.
And so, I mean, what does that look like in terms of when you're taking psychedelics? Do you have any rules as to how often you're doing it or in what situation?
This is going to sound kind of crazy arbitrary, but most of Shock Induction I wrote while I was frozen into my house during an ice storm in the middle of this last winter. There were about 10 days when we had feet and feet of snow outside, and it was nothing but the white noise of wind blowing, and there was no street traffic. No one could come within miles of where I lived. And it was basically like being in The Shining. I was in a large house, completely snowed in. All the light that came into the house was that kind of very blue-white, sort of complete lack of visual stimulation and lack of auditory stimulation because of the wind. So it was really just me and the computer and the wood stove and the story. So that kind of complete lack of external stimuli allowed me a focus I've never had before and allowed me to do this enormous rewrite in what really only amounted to a couple weeks' time. And again,
Yeah,
I'm not endorsing locking yourself away and doing psychogenic drugs, but it worked.
well, people have to do what works for them at the time. We always say your mileage may vary. Take the advice that you like and discard what does not work. But I mean, to go all the way back to the beginning, what was the origin story for shock induction? What was your why?
In 2019, I was asked to come down and to pitch all the streaming platforms with every idea I could that came to mind. And I was fascinated by the idea that when people succeeded, they immediately left their spouse and they got a trophy wife. They upgraded to a much more maybe attractive but more status indicating spouse, man or woman. In fact, when Fight Club went into production as a movie, someone really highly placed with the production of 20th Century Fox took me aside and said, "Now that you have a movie in production, are you going to stay with Mike?" And I'd been with Mike for 5 or 6 years at that point, and it had never occurred to me that I should ditch Mike just because I had a book becoming a movie. But that is what so many people do, especially writers, is at the moment they get some success, they ditch the old spouse and they upgrade to a trophy spouse. So I thought by extension, why wouldn't people apply this same dynamic to their kids? That, why should you take a chance on just staying with the kids that you've born and raised? Why not upgrade your kids as well and just kind of cut loose your existing kids and with the hope that somebody else would find them appealing and someone else would adopt them? But you yourself should not be stuck with just the kids that you can have, that you should be able to upgrade the way you would a spouse.
Yeah, and I think too that the way that shock induction and this greener pastures universe is created, you said before that in the future people will crave their 15 minutes of privacy rather than 15 minutes of fame. And this is the ultimate vision of that because there is no privacy left. Everything and everyone has been publicly commodified and available to the highest bidder.
And you have to wonder what's going to happen to all of these OnlyFans models in even a few years when they age out of that system. There's going to be an enormous kind of displacement of labor kind of eroticized labor that we've never seen before. And I find that all incredibly fascinating. Will they all end up as a kind of Marilyn Monroe sort of tragic figures? Or what will they sort of move on to?
Yeah, I think with that kind of thing, there is like a ticking clock. And so, really, it's like, let's just kind of, I was going to say milk it. Well, I mean, literally and, and metaphorically, let's milk it as well. And for as long as we can, and then see kind of what we have at the end.
And it's rather short-sighted, but I think that's also the other appealing aspect of shock induction was it's trading that kind of full potential for a kind of complete stability. The rest of your life is not going to be what you want, but it will be completely guaranteed and stable, and you won't have to worry about being sort of cast aside and and laid off and made redundant, made obsolete.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, another element of this book, and as always, we'll jump around to different topics, is hypnosis. And I understand that in terms of your preparation, you went to HypnoThoughts Live as part of the research. What was that like? And was that one of your first experiences with the hypnosis scene, for want of better phrasing?
It was last year I took courses from a local hypnotist, and he taught me a lot of the distinctions, but he also said that I needed to go to HypnoThoughts just to sort of get a fuller understanding of the entire hypno thing. And it was about as close to a psychotic break as I ever want to come, because everyone knew these mentalist tricks and these hypno games and these different techniques except for me. And so in every conference and every presentation, I was basically the sucker. And so I got played by all these people who do it for a living. And that left me with this enormous confusion. It took me weeks to kind of come out of it. I felt like I really had dementia for a while. Um, yeah. And it all took place within 2.5 days. So I really had no time to process it. It would be, these very long days of being with these people and then going back to my hotel room and not drinking. And so it took me weeks to try to process, what I just experienced.
And so, in terms of those experiences, what were perhaps some of the more unusual or the more shocking during that conference?
Oh, when I was a reporter, this would have made a great kind of farcical piece because, in just generalized ways, I noticed that all of the men that I was interacting with in this hundreds or thousands of people, they were all either reverends, so they were ministers, they led congregations. And so much of what they did in terms of public speaking in their churches was about hypnosis. It was about finding compliance by shouting, "Who'll give me an amen? Who'll give me a hallelujah?" And then whoever is out there in the congregation that shouts amen or hallelujah, you know that they're compliant, and you can work that person or you can work those individuals to sort of build a deeper and deeper compliance. So much of this ministry was about hypnosis. And another aspect of the men was that they wanted to be stage hypnotists. So they were all guys who wanted to work on cruise ships, or they wanted to work the big corporate events where you would go to some place like AT&T or Microsoft, and they would tell you the message they wanted you to sort of hypnotize into their workforce. So you would do these huge executive retreats where you would have 100 people, and you'd be doing what seemed to be a very entertaining, funny stage show. But at the same time, you would really be hypnotizing them to be more productive and to be more loyal and to, sacrifice everything for the company. So you had the ministers, you had the guys who wanted to lead executive retreats for big corporations because that's where the money is. But you also had the guys who wanted to work cruise ships. And you had these kind of skeezy comedian guys who wanted to do sexy suntan lotion and to hypnotize drunken women into sexualizing themselves on stage in this very public way. So you had this huge spectrum from these religious men who were doing it for their congregations, their churches, to these men who were doing it because they want to get drunken women to fondle their breasts on stage. And then among the women in this convention, they for the most part saw themselves as healers. And so they were about healing and nurturing, and hypnosis was a kind of form of therapy. And so it was all very nurturing in that way. But this whole break between women as healers and men as kind of manipulative leaders or controllers was interesting to be with. And that's just one of a million different, very small things.
And you said about kind of getting played during, the presentations and the different situations, but did you also have many interactions with people who, just in what was meant to be a normal conversation, it's like, wait, they're trying to use their material on me, kind of outside of this presentation?
Well, one of the good things I learned was that the hardest people, if not impossible people to hypnotize, are men over the age of 50. And I am 62, which really puts me outside of the window for hypnosis. Uh, so that seemed to kind of be working in my favor. And I noticed that for a lot of the men who complained that they could not be induced into a trance, for the most part, they tended to be older men who presented as I would argue more intelligent uh, than a lot of the people who could be induced very easily. And there were these strange kind of power games. One that stands out was a woman who was a hypnotherapist, and she insisted that she had increased her breast size by writing a script and listening to this hypnotic script every night as she fell asleep. And that every month that she listened to the script, her breasts increased 1 cup size. And I thought I was kind of I was skeptical. I thought, maybe you just stood straighter, or maybe you just tensed your pectoral muscles a little more, or maybe you just held your shoulders back and presented your chest larger. But I really didn't see how hypnosis could enlarge her breasts. And in response to that, she took out her phone and she started showing me photographs of her breasts from the beginning throughout several weeks or months of this script. And in a way, I wanted to be polite, but I did not want to be standing there in public looking at photographs of a woman's bare breasts. As she insisted, they're larger. You have to say they're larger. And she just kept on sort of dominating by presenting her breasts shown from what I thought was different angles. I really thought that it was the angle of the phone that made them look larger or smaller. And when I continued to be skeptical, she started to pull up photographs of her mother's breasts, who was a much older woman. And she insisted that she had increased the size of her mother's breasts with hypnosis. And now I'm looking at the bare breasts of an even older woman in a public place until I finally acquiesce and say, okay, I understand. You've done it. It works. But in some cases, it did seem like it was more about dominating than it was about actually convincing me.
Yeah, that is a surreal situation to find yourself in. And I mean, in terms of those photos that she was presenting, it kind of sounds like some of those body transformation photos where you see that this has happened in 12 weeks with muscle building, but then the lighting and the angle and even what the person is wearing, and they've like shaved down their chest hair.
Yep.
And it's like you're using all of the old tricks to make it look, to visually appear that you're more muscular, but in fact you're not. you know
So it was interesting to be the skeptic in a huge space full of believers, because everyone there was a believer and was very invested in hypnosis. Uh, and I didn't want to sort of disillusion anyone by sort of raining on their parade.
Yeah, I think it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, or it's like you're going there because you want to believe. It's like if you go to a religious convention or you become a member of a cult, it's fairly easy to get people to go along because they want it to be true. There's a desperation in it.
And I love cults. I adore cults. And so in that way, I really loved being there, because it's nice to be around people who have this kind of strong faith, um, and are at least unified by that shared faith. Um, and it's nice to be in this kind of community where your role is kind of dictated by the faith, by the belief system. And I write about that so much in every book since Fight Club, is that Fight Club gives you this very consensual but very structured way of being together. And that's a lot of what I found at HypnoThoughts.
And so prior to writing this book, had you ever been hypnotized before? Have you hypnotized someone? I don't know if this is something that has been an interest long preceding this book, or if it's only really turned up for writing Shock Induction.
It was really something I only wanted um, to use for Shock Induction. I knew that the story was going to be just too linear, that it needed another kind of meta layer to it. And I was looking at hypnosis. I've also been taking acting classes, because the different sort of techniques or methods for getting into character seemed like they would be really good meta layers to add to a narrative. Um, Mushrooms, there's a lot of sort of psychogenic stuff that's also baked into Shock Induction. A lot of books are being kept out of prisons because paper has become the new medium, or for decades now, the medium for getting drugs into prisons. And there's been so much in the culture about people picking up paper money off the street that is saturated with fentanyl, and people having these kind of episodes because they have exposed themselves to a kind of transdermal fentanyl. And so there's just so much in the culture about paper as a means for delivering drugs that I wanted that to be another meta level. But auspiciously, when I went into hypnosis, it was because when I was 3 years old, I developed this huge growth on the side of my neck, like a tiny 3-year-old Chuck with this giant growth. And the doctor thought it might be this kind of fibrous tuberculosis. And so this would have been in 1965. And my parents, who were very young parents, they had to take me to the hospital for his operation, where they were going to cut into this growth and see what the nature of it was. And at some point, according to this family story that I've always heard my entire life, the 3-year-old me, I died. I was dead on the operating table for 2, 3, 4 minutes before the doctor went out into the waiting area and told my parents that I was dead. And my parents went through this intense grief and shock. And the doctor went back to the operating theater. And at some point, I wasn't dead. So he had to awkwardly go back and tell my parents, your child has been dead for about 5 to 7 minutes, but your child is alive now. And I was always curious, because I'd heard that story so many times. My mother loved to tell that story because it had such a happy ending. They were so bereft, and then they were suddenly so joyous that it made a really it's a story that delivered her, that always returned her to a state of sort of euphoria and ecstasy. And so she loved to tell a story because it made her happy. But I always wondered, where was I during that 5 to 7 minutes? So I went in and asked the hypnotherapist, can you try to get me back there? Can you show me what may or may not have happened? And over the course of months of hypnotherapy, I kind of got a really good answer, but I don't want to talk about it here because it will make me sound like a lunatic. I don't want to be one of those near-death experience kind of crazy-sounding people, but it was a fantastic discovery. And it was another thing that kept me exploring hypnosis.
Do you think it is something that you will ever talk about in any medium, or is this something you won't talk about publicly?
You know, I'll never say never, but to talk about it now would make me sound like a crackpot. Yeah, and it's enough that it makes me incredibly happy. The discovery I made in hypnosis made me happy in the same way that my recovery and my failure to die made my mother and my father happy. And so I don't want to kind of lose that happiness by sharing it. I want to hold on to it.
So, on that basis, if people have things that they want to recover from their past, would you recommend hypnosis, or at least for people to consider going down that path?
I think I would, but I think it depends a lot on the practitioner. Because even at HypnoThoughts, I met a lot of people who seemed to be very good at it, and a lot of people who just really wanted to be very good at it. And the people who wanted to be good at it tended to be bullies. And nobody needs to pay money to get bullied. And so if you do see a hypnotherapist, just be really careful in choosing the right one, because the ones who can't do it will just take your money and just kind of bully you for the whole period.
Yeah, years and years ago, it's a lot of the nightclubs I used to go out to when I went out. We had probably about every couple months we'd have a hypnotist come and do like the show. And one of the first things that they would talk about is how they're actually licensed hypnotists, and they can they have a lot of services that they can talk to you about, but they want to do some entertainment. And one particular evening that I remember distinctly is I had a friend of mine who was convinced he could not be hypnotized. And so we watched the show. He said, all this stuff is fake. All these people are planted in the audience and all this. It's all fake. I have a bachelor of science degree in psychology. So I'm like, well, there's some truth to it. But, and so after the show, the hypnotist was hanging around in the bar and, having a couple of drinks and things like that. So my buddy decided he was going to go and basically talk to this hypnotist and tell him that he could not be hypnotized, that he's one of those people. And hypnotist, told him, hey, yeah, there's quite a few people that, I can't hypnotize very quickly. He goes, everyone has a different threshold. And he goes, and even if you feel like that you have like an issue that you need to be working with, you want to quit smoking, something like that. Even if you can't be hypnotized, I may be able to help you work through that. He goes, that's something in my practice. And so while he's talking to my friend, he leans over and says something to him and then looks at us and goes, y'all need to get him because he's out.
Yeah.
He hypnotized him that fast. And we caught him and laid him down. And then he says, hey, I'll do a couple of things, but I can't make him do anything he won't do. Like, And so he made him bark like a dog. And he made him act like he, become a table, and he sat down on him and all this, So
that's called human bridge, and it is incredibly unethical. And they
yeah.
lectured against that. Human bridge is off the table now.
Yeah.
But please.
Yeah, you got to keep in mind too, this is probably like maybe 15, 20 years ago, So things obviously things have changed. But yeah, he sat down on him and and talked a little bit to us, and he gave everybody a card. And he said, "Hey, the only thing I'm going to make him remember is that he barked like a dog. That way he'll know that he was hypnotized. But he won't remember me sitting on him, So he woke him up, and it took a minute to get him awake because he was very, very deep. And when he came to, it was like we had him to where he was just sitting down, but he continued the same sentence he was saying when he woke up. It's like he didn't just come out of it slowly. It's like when he finally came out of it, he was talking. He was like, and then he was like looking around. He goes, "When did I sit down?" And we're like going, "Dude, you got hypnotized." And he was like, "Bullshit, y'all are a bunch of liars." And he goes, "Do you remember barking like a dog?" And he goes, "Yeah, I did bark like you hypnotized me, didn't you?" And he was like, I didn't think I could be hypnotized. And he was like, "Yeah." He goes, "You went under pretty quick." He goes, "But you went pretty deep."
Well,
No, it's just interesting.
and I'm curious because with the whispering, a lot of times that is a form of what they call shock induction.
Yeah.
That's in hypnosis, like the title of the book, you either kind of exhaust the person by calling their attention to too many things. You kind of exhaust and confuse them to the point where their rational mind sort of disengages for an instant, or you shock them so that their rational mind is kind of disoriented for a moment, and at that point, uh, they're vulnerable. You can induce the trance, and so I'm wondering, just that what that whispered word was, or it's a sensation of suddenly having that person that close in your physical space. Because there's a lot of forms of physical hypnosis where you touch the person's neck and you pull them in such a way that they feel like they're falling for a moment, like you go through in the hypnagogic trance as you're falling asleep. You feel like you're falling for an instant, and it throws you into this kind of panic, fight or flight state, and that's what makes you vulnerable, so that the hypnotic trance can take place.
Yeah. That's how he did. That's how he did. Like when he did the show, when he had volunteers, some of them he would lean in and you couldn't hear a word he was saying, and they would go out and he would go, "Sit, please," and they would sit down, because he had them all stand. But a couple of them he would go in close and he was like, "Oh, you're going to be a little tough one," and he would put your arms out in front of you, and he'd grab their hands and tug them, and he'd be like, "Sit down, please," and they'd all sit there. And he goes, "Hey, I want y'all to all just go to sleep." And once he had everybody done, and they just, nod out. And we were like, "Wow, this is crazy," But with my background, I'm like, this is believable. I'm actually seeing what we talked about in class, and it was really cool.
And also going back to compliance, like with the religious people, who will give me an amen, who will give me a hallelujah.
Right.
The first part of a hypnosis is finding out who's going to be compliant. And so those people who volunteer to go onto the stage are slightly compliant. And after that, you're basically kind of testing them to see who is going to be the most performative. And your friend proved himself compliant by simply going forward in the bar and saying, "You can't do it."
Yeah.
And so he made himself the most compliant person.
Yeah. If I remember correctly, there was I'm fairly confident there was one person that he asked to go back and sit down, because I don't even think he tried to tug him. I think he just basically looked at him and said something, and then he says, "Hey, you can have a seat." He goes, "You're gonna mess up my whole thing," And the guy's like, "Oh, I can't be hypnotized." He goes, "Well, you probably can." He goes, "But for this, nah."
Exactly. You get a bunch of people up there, and then you just start culling them until you get the ones who are going to put on the best show.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
And you combine that with the suggestion of psychotropic drugs in the paper. And then you present it with a story, a kind of guided meditation. And going back to Fight Club more or less really starts with those support groups where the people who are dying are taken on a guided meditation. You are approaching the palace of the seven doors. You open the green door. What is beyond the green door? You step into the cave of your power animal. And then we get the penguin. And so a lot of people argue that the narrator in Fight Club never came out of that hypnotic trance, that the entire narrative is that person induced into a trance, like in the movie, what am I thinking of? The movie that is constant nested loops. Insurrection? No. What am I thinking of?
Inception with Leonardo
Inception.
DiCaprio.
Exactly. Yeah, where you're going through one portal after another, which hypnotists call loops, nested loops, where you're taken through one doorway or one window or just one rabbit hole after another. And you're taken deeper and deeper. They're called deepening the trance techniques, deepeners. And then you're constantly anchored with little triggers. And in shock induction, the word paramecium is the anchoring device that is supposed to constantly bring you in or out of trance. Like sounds are a big part of hypnotic induction because they're nonverbal. So, sorry, I just went down a rabbit hole myself and I can't get myself back out. But again, ever since Fight Club, I have been kind of doing that kind of guided meditation, which I think good storytelling does. It walks you into the situation in a physical way, as opposed to just dictating it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think with shock induction, there's such a balance that you're achieving here because you're simultaneously telling the story of Samantha Deal, who somehow we haven't even named the protagonist yet. We've been talking for over half an hour, but she is, of course, the protagonist whose parents have kind of put her on the market to trying to sell her, and she's quite rebellious too. But you've got the dystopian and the greener pastures universe, but you're trying to balance that with hypnotizing the reader. How did you kind of strike that in terms of trying to employ these techniques and simultaneously present a story?
I always think of long form prose as oral storytelling. And, ultimately, my teacher, who died just a couple of weeks ago, my best teacher, Tom Spanbauer, had a heart attack just before I left for tour. And Tom always made us present our work out loud. Because if you read it out loud, you will find out where you're no longer interested yourself, where you bore yourself. And you can see in your audience, you can see that another aspect of hypnosis is they call it eye capture, which I think is a fantastic term. You want to catch the person, make them look into your eyes, look into my eyes. And as soon as you capture their eyes with eye capture, then you can really control or guide them, induce them into a trance. But if you tell a story out loud and you can't even trance yourself into the story, then you know that story's not worth it, that it's not well written or it's not worth hearing. And so telling a story out loud or telling it in a way that an oral storyteller would tell it with that kind of immediacy and that kind of constant shift to second person or third person or first person, keeping it really fresh has always been a big part of my technique in writing fiction.
And another aspect that I think kind of is something that goes into this too is not only are you telling the narrative of Samantha Deal, but there are also these hallucinatory passages. As you said in the afterword, there's a lot of references to Alice in Wonderland. I mean, there's a lot of references to many texts, The Great Gatsby, Anna Karenina, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. But because you've got these hallucinations, I mean, do you even know which parts are reality and which parts are hallucinatory as the author, because there are some bits where it's like, well, it could kind of go either way here.
Well, really at its core, I wanted to write a book about books. And so, in the style of minimalism, the idea is to present the same thing for so many number of pages, but to present the same topic in as many different ways as possible. And my classic example is always to the television commercial. I didn't really understand minimalism in Tom's workshop until I came home from workshop one night and I turned on the television. And there was a commercial for Skipper Seafood. And within that few number of 30 seconds or whatever, they showed us napkins, signage, containers, happy families. They showed us fish. They showed us all these things that basically all equated to Skipper's Seafood. And so in Shock Induction, I wanted to depict books in as many ways as possible within a book. So really it starts with the physical object that a book is. Feel the paper, listen to the sound that it makes as you turn the page. And then it goes to those Senate Subcommittee on Education hearings about why no one is reading long form prose anymore. So it is overtly announcing that this is going to be a book about books. And going into the second act, fried out of my mind on mushrooms, I thought, how can I present books in a different way in the second portion of the book? And I thought, what if I sampled classic public domain party scenes? So I looked up The Great Gatsby, which is the ultimate party scenes, and Anna Karenina party scenes, and basically lifted passages from famous literary parties and put my characters into them. And so in that way, I could present, again, books, but in a different way. And so throughout the entire book, you're basically seeing the topic of books presented over and over throughout the book until the end of the book. And that's another way I wanted to make it very meta, because I wanted to write a book about books for people who love books. And so it would be about books on every level, and it would really accomplish that minimalist thing.
Yeah, and of course, the authorities within Shock Induction from the start are very much against books. They're trying to get them banned. They
Yeah.
feel threatened by them, and this also feeds into the way that they're selecting who will and who won't be successful in greener pastures. I mean, the idea is to weed out those who are rebellious, to weed out, those who are going to be disruptors. They want conformity, and books, they have ideas, they encourage rebellion. So I love that juxtaposition of, what's simultaneously going on, particularly in the prison system, and trying to get rid of these books, and within the schools, with the way that Greener Pastures as an entity operates.
And people complain about piracy on the internet. And the downside is that, yeah, to some extent, it's harder to make your living as a writer or as a filmmaker or as really anything, because your work can be pirated so easily. But on the upside, I think if someone got the right idea, the idea that would just sort of change the culture in an instant, that idea could go around the world 100 times within a moment. And the upside is that when somebody gets a better idea, it's going to change everything so quickly, and it will be impossible to suppress. And so in a way, that was the idea for these enhanced reader editions in Shock Induction, these books that the government is trying to suppress by the end of the book.
Yeah, and I mean, the author's note in chapter 33, where you talk
Yeah.
about these billionaires creating this website and then making a customized steamroller. Where did this come from? I need to hear more.
It was at a book event. It wasn't my book. I was supporting another book. But afterwards, and I had to change some of the details for legal reasons. Afterwards, a party of very, very happy tech billionaires approached me and told me that they were going to make all literature available to all people, regardless of copyright or compensation to the authors. And they sat there so self-satisfied and just so thinking that I was going to applaud them for it, that I thought, dude, you've got health insurance and I need to pay for my health insurance. So, you need to maybe be thinking about how this is going to affect writers who are just barely scraping by.
Yeah, it's such a bizarre situation to find yourself in. And were they taken aback by your negative reaction? Were they so self-absorbed and confident in this that they didn't anticipate that an author might not be for this?
It was such an awkward moment. I barely remember. I remember suppressing my rage, just suppressing just how profoundly angry I was in that moment. And I just remember them being sort of hurt that I wasn't more grateful and happy that they had this grand vision.
And of course, you have different passages and chapters a little like this throughout the book that are separate from the main narrative, although they all kind of come together and feed in. Another particular favorite towards the end is a cautionary tale from Mindy B. So, I mean, in a sense, this is also an epistolary story because of all the different mediums and the way that it's been presented. I mean, goodness, you've even got two chapters that are a single word.
Uh, that was an experiment, and my editor, Tim, loved the idea that we would just repeat the word avocado like a mantra until it lost all meaning. It just became a pattern on the page like wallpaper. And so I felt sorry for the guy who would eventually have to do the audiobook because he was going to have to say the word avocado with all these different intonations. And, but that wasn't my problem. So it was really about sort of doing as many of those tricks because the way we consume story now, ever since we started channel surfing with the remote controls, we started to really cut story in our minds in a different way. Maybe film started doing this because film cuts reality the way that we blink, the way that we have to blink in order to sort of break up reality into bite-sized chunks that we can process. So in a way, the film cut is the equivalent to you blinking your eyes. And supposedly, that goes back to eye capture, because if you can hold someone's attention and keep them from blinking, then you can really induce them into a trance state. And I see Bob just touched his eye, which means I'm not doing my job right, because he had a physical sense that he was him. The idea is to kind of, by constantly introducing new textures and doing eye capture, you are constantly renewing someone's interest in the subject, and you're forcing them to consume, in this case, long form prose, very much the way that they would web surf, in very small bites, or the way that they would channel surf, in very small bites of things that have very different textures.
Okay, so we have to talk for longer about the avocado scenes, and we have to then talk about Samantha's uncle. And I think the story arc with Samantha's uncle is so satisfying and one of my favorite parts of the book. Incredibly disturbing, but there's such a wonderful payoff and revelation. And so this is a guy who he's wheelchair bound. He's spent 7 years in prison. He's a sex offender. and Samantha essentially has to look after him and, amongst other things, clean his shitty diapers. So that's the uncle. Now, I wonder, now he doesn't say a lot, but what he does say is avocado many, many times. Of all the words to repeat, why avocado?
The uncle, supposedly, it's part of his backstory, was in a sexual encounter where the safe word was avocado. And he was subsequently sent to prison because he claimed he had forgotten that the safe word was avocado. And he had continued the sexual encounter beyond the point that avocado was said. And so avocado, as that safe word, becomes this thing that he repeats to himself as the moment that he really screwed up. He fucked up in such a way that the rest of his life was going to be about the fact that he'd forgotten the word avocado, supposedly forgotten the word. So, it could be rape, it could be not rape. But that's what avocado really represents, is this ultimate failure in life, whether you intentionally went forward with a sexual encounter and raped someone, or whether you were just stupid and you were just forgot that avocado was a safe word. Avocado really comes to present that moment where you fucked up in such a way that the rest of your life is going to be about that moment.
Yeah, and you said that, you've got avocado for many pages, but it's not just copy and pasted, because sometimes it's hyphenated, sometimes it's italicized, sometimes there's an exclamation mark, an exclamation mark even after it. And have you listened to the audiobook?
No,
I so
I listen to the auditions, but I don't listen to the book because more and more, I've been trying to play to the fact, like with last year's book, Not Forever, But For Now, having different passages repeated in different languages. Because nowadays, throwing a strange foreign phrase in Sanskrit is not a hurdle anymore. It gives the reader a greater participation. The reader can decipher foreign languages more readily than they could in the past. So it makes devices like that a lot more appealing, a little more of a game. And so I feel sorry for the actor who has to figure out how to say all these strange phrases in foreign languages. But I just don't want to hear it.
So I have listened to the audiobook. So I've read it and I've listened to the audiobook a number of times in preparation for this. And I have to say, he does an amazing job of the avocado scenes. And there's so much variation in terms of how he delivers it. And I mean, yeah, if I were to audition anyone to repeat avocado for 5 minutes, it would be that guy. He absolutely spot on. But I did find it funny that I was looking at people's responses to this, and there was somebody who'd written a review getting very upset that 5 minutes of the audiobook is just avocado. But
Well, see that in my day, when you listen to the radio, every once in a while, the DJ would go to take a crap and have to leave the booth, and the record would skip. And you'd be listening to AM radio, and there would be a skip in the record, and everyone within listening market would be hearing that skip. And you knew that the DJ was in the bathroom doing a number two, or otherwise they would be fixing the skip. And then suddenly the DJ would rush back into the booth and the skip would end, and there'd be a moment of sort of levity. But in those moments of disconnect, it's very much like shock induction, like Bob's friend getting whispered, is that suddenly the rational world breaks down. And the rational world that you want to be this orderly, continuous flow of information that makes sense, it suddenly doesn't make sense. There's a break, and the break is very upsetting, and it's supposed to be upsetting because that's why it's shock induction. And so, again, repeating Avocado is very much like the DJ in the bathroom, completely helpless, while the record skips and skips and skips. And it's also like Bill Withers in that great song, Ain't No Sunshine When She's Gone. I know, 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 I ought to leave the young thing alone. Ain't no sunshine when she's gone. We love that. Oh my God. Bill Withers just works, I know, so many gorgeous ways. And he breaks the language down. And the language, those two words become musical notes. And it creates tension because you want the song to continue. And it illustrates longing, and it illustrates this gorgeous frustration. She's underage. She's underage, but I love her, and she makes my life special. And I know, I know, I know, I know, I know I ought to leave the young thing alone, but there ain't no sunshine when she's gone. And so, again, we're going back to creating frustration, creating, depicting longing, and also generating frustration and anger in the reader so that they can feel what the uncle is feeling. That guy or whoever reviewed the book and said, it really pissed me off, felt exactly how the uncle felt as he spent the rest of his life saying avocado to himself.
Yeah.
Mission accomplished. Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, and for me that there was so much packed in to the avocado scenes because yeah, you've got frustration, you've got humor, you've got confusion, you've almost got despair. Like how long is this going to go on for? But
And I always think that a story doesn't work unless there's some point where the language breaks down to chaos. Because in my favorite songs, uh, the language breaks down to chaos. Eventually, the Beach Boys are just wailing, they're yodeling. We no longer have words, we just have extended musical notes, or we have Sid Vicious screaming at the end of a punk rock song. We have some point where the song breaks down to just the rhythm in Be My Baby by the Ronettes. At some point, a song breaks down to complete chaos, whether it's the loss of vocals or whether it's vocals becoming noise, screaming, yodeling. And so, in a short story or a book, I think that there has to be a point where the language breaks down to chaos. Otherwise, the book has the work hasn't done what its potential is. It has to bring language to chaos.
yeah, and speaking of chaos there, that striking image kind of at the end of the uncle passage seemed like a homage to one of my favorite horror movies in a very blatant way. And I don't want to say any more because I don't want to really spoil that for people going in. I want them to go into it cold and to not see what happens at the end of the kind of Uncle Samantha scene.
Well, I thought my clever thing was repeating basically the execution of the horse Frou Frou in Tolstoy,
Yeah.
tying that to this despicable figure, because Frou Frou, the little mare in the steeplechase scene, is such a completely sympathetic figure that to kind of recreate that scene, but with a completely unsympathetic figure in the form of the predatory uncle, um, I just felt like I was playing a trick on Tolstoy.
Yeah, and I mean, talking about, having these references to other books and being in conversation with other texts? I mean, how important do you find this is in general? Of course, with this book, as you said, it is essentially a love letter to books, but do you think referencing these other tomes is a good kind of storytelling device, not only to tell your own story, but to elevate it?
Well, on a crafty, wily level, you want to reward the smart people. The smart people are going to be like, hey, wait, this is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, or this is a passage from Moby Dick, that he has usurped this gorgeous passage from Moby Dick for his own purposes. And they'll feel smart and righteous that they recognized it. And the people who aren't as well read will sort of stumble over this strange new style for a passage. And it allows them a discovery process where they can slowly find out after the fact that this is what I was doing. And there's a great sociologist named Shirley Bryce Heath, and she says that a book doesn't become a classic unless it forms a community of people to understand it. And her favorite example would be Tolkien, that people have to really come together to talk about Tolkien to try to have a full understanding of Tolkien or of books like the Dune books. They're so rich that people have to form a community, and they bring people together to really understand what's taking place. And so ultimately, with those excerpts, with all these different methods, you want to create a certain amount of confusion so that people do go to community to try to understand the parts that they did not understand or that they felt were beyond them. So it forces people to reach out through the internet to try to, contact each other and to really understand what's taking place here. Thank you, Shirley Bryce Heath.
There you go. And I mean, with this as well, I know that a few years ago, you put out Greener Pastures on Substack. So I want to know, is this a completely different story in the same universe? Is this an early version of what became Shock Induction? Because one imagines that there is a link between the two.
In my mind, it was like what Danielewski had done with House of Leaves, that there was this giant rambling first draft on the internet, and people read it, and then ultimately he turned it into a book, and he did in a book the things that he could not do on the internet, where he ran the words in these spirals and these different patterns. So with each medium, with the internet, he did it one way. With the printed book, he did it a largely different way because he could take advantage of the new medium. Printing it on paper would allow him to pattern the words in different ways. And so the serialized version on Substack, which I think I put out in 2021, was very fatty compared to what the book is. It was probably way too long, and it had too many backstories and it had too many tangents. But the internet allows for that because you don't have to hold the entire internet in your hand. When you're sitting on an airplane and you've got to hold the physical thing, you want it to be much more lean and much more manageable. And so, and again, going back to House of Leaves, with each iteration, I was trying to do what each medium would do better.
And I wonder, how did the response from your initial readers on Substack shape the Shock Induction book?
I don't trust response. And that was another reason why Tom had us read our work out loud. Because when you read the work, the most honest response is whether people gasp or whether they touch their eye like Bob did, whether they look at their watch, whether they laugh, whether they cry. You want to see what the response is in the moment. because everything after that is so intellectualized and so processed that it's really more about the reader than it is about the story. And so I don't think I could trust the intellectualized after the fact response that I would have gotten from the Substack serialized version. Because once people have to articulate their response, I don't trust it as much. It becomes about them as opposed to about the story itself. And that's another reason why I really push my students to read their work out loud in a setting where other students can hear it.
Yeah, I've noticed too a commonality for your fondness for England, because Samantha Deal is deemed to be the Queen of England. That is what she's set up to have. And of course, your previous novel, Not Forever, but for Now, was set in the English countryside, in Wales, in fact, I think. So the UK at least. And so do you have an affinity for England? Is this something we're going to see a lot more of going forward?
Well, in a way, they were kind of strange little bookends for each other, because Not Forever, but for Now was written just before Queen Elizabeth II died. And so, in a way, it ends the reign of Elizabeth, but then it presents a new queen in the promise that Samantha Deal is supposed to marry Prince Archie. And so, in that one small way, there is a symmetry between the two books.
Yeah, and I mean with Samantha Deal, and I guess with the whole book, I mean the idea is that you can have any job in the world except the one that you actually want. That is right at the core, and that is the kind of nightmare reality. Because I mean, how does one even navigate that if that is your destiny?
But it's a destiny that young people really face very early in their lives. Do I take the job at the post office because it's got benefits and it's got stability and I can do it? Or do I sort of follow my passion? And there are those people who can do them both. Bukowski, who can deliver the mail and write his stuff. But there are a lot of people who take the stability job and they try to practice their passion on the side. And toward the end of their life, they've deferred all of their passion, and they realize very late in life that it's too late, that they've missed a window for training and developing their talent. And once that window is closed, they're going to have to come to terms with the fact that they chose stability and safety over the thing that excited them as a young person. Um, and I think it's a terrifying choice, but it's something that people look at the age of 17 and 18.
Yeah, and we said before that this is very prescient, this book. And I mean, another way that it plays into people's lives, there's a scene where we find that a kid has been secretly put on the market by his parents, but he couldn't even attract the minimum bid. And one day he might find out about that and it will absolutely crush him. But I think, and it to a point goes back to some of the things you were saying about OnlyFans, because a lot of people find out every day through social media or through OnlyFans that actually they're not as popular as they thought they would. You're putting, a post out into the world, and we see the ones that go viral, we see the successes, but for every hugely popular OnlyFans creator, there is the person who uploaded lots of content and nobody gave a shit.
And you know who's making money? OnlyFans, the
Yes.
platform, the device that communicates their vulnerability to the world, is the only entity that is consistently making bank. And so, in a way, Greener Pastures is the entity that is ongoingly making money from whether these people sort of, sell their souls or don't sell their souls. It's the kind of mediating entity that is the one that's always consistently making a profit. And I find that so angering and heartbreaking at the same time.
Yeah. Yes. And I mean that there almost seems to be a tie-in with War Dog and Stephanie, and such an interesting character there. And I think Stephanie is the perfect name, particularly for Daddy to talk to. There's something.
Oh.
Maybe it's just the. I don't know. Is it just how it sounds lyrically when it comes out of your mouth, or is it the fact that it's three syllables? Because I did think Stefan is the perfect name, but I'm trying to work out why. Why is it so good for that situation?
One thing that kind of works in an odd, broken way is that Stephanie spells her name one way when we see her attribution, but her father, when he addresses her, Stephanie is misspelled. It's spelled a different way. So it's a physical demonstration that he clearly does not know who she is, or he clearly devalues her. And so that was another trick I wanted to do throughout the book, was those typographical errors. Because when you stumble across typographical errors, again, it's another form of shock induction, where your brain is scrambling and your brain is frustrated and your brain is thinking, who the hell is this guy? Didn't anybody ever edit this book that they couldn't even spell this word right? Or they misquoted this one sentence from The Great Gatsby, because in the party sequence, there's a reference to a great pit full of oboes and cellos and all these instruments. But I just changed pitful into pitiful. And the reader will stumble there, think, you know, somebody's clearly not caring about this book. But all of these typos are intentional for creating these beats of refreshing, like that. Boom. It pops you in that Brechtian way out of the narrative. You're thinking, what the hell was that? What the hell was that? Why is he saying avocado so many times? God damn it. What's he doing? And it's creating that frustration and making you present to the story again. It's in hypnosis what they would call deepening devices, these moments that deepen the trance.
Yeah, I find whenever I'm reading one of your books, because of the expectation that previous books have set, I'm waiting to be tricked. I'm waiting for that error. I remember the tomato famine in Not Forever, But For Now, the Richard and David Attenborough confusion. So that there's an anticipation for that. But in spite of it, you often still catch me off guard.
Well, it always is a great device for creating sympathy with the narrator. The very first thing that Scarlett O'Hara says in Gone with the Wind is war, war, war. There's not going to be a war. And we're thinking, she's rich, she's lovely, she's adored, and Christ, is she in for a big fall. She's so stupid and naive that our heart goes out to Scarlett O'Hara, because despite all of her advantages, we're smarter than she is, and we know there's going to be a war. And we know her entire world is about to be destroyed. So despite all of her advantages, we feel sympathy for her. And so when you have a character misstate something, you create an opportunity for the reader to feel superior, pathetic towards the character. I think in Doomed or Damned, Madison, the adolescent narrator, she quotes the Bible as, it's easier for a rich person to go to heaven than it is to push caramels through the eye of a needle. And just by saying caramels instead of pushing a camel, creates that moment of enjambment, they call it in poetry, where you have an expectation and you get the wrong connection. And so that disconnect, that enjambment, it heightens the reader's presence to what's on the page. And they have to go back and think, did I just read the wrong word there? Or was it the wrong word? It's like when you see badly translated menus and you see the typo that makes the whole menu very hilarious. It gives you a real sense of the humanity of whoever created the menu. And your heart is engaged on an emotional level. You're no longer just intellectually engaged. You're engaged in a kind of under the radar emotional level. And that's what these getting things wrong does.
Yeah, you of course see that quite often here in Japan with the
Ah,
English menus, but sometimes these so-called mistranslations or these direct translations, there's something endearing, there's something that makes it so much more recognizable, and you want to order those things, you want to engage with those shoppers. It I guess it's this idea of, goodness, how is it put, where the flaw becomes the selling point, the bug becomes the feature. Yeah.
um, years ago, I was in Barcelona with a bunch of writers, and David Sedaris was one of the writers, and we were in a big dinner at a restaurant, and there was a translated item on the menu that said feet of unborn pigs. And David just had to order it to see what this can't be the feet of unborn pigs. And it was. It was the aborted fetuses of pigs, and all these little gray legs were all pickled and arranged in a big wreath on the plate. So it was this big glossy gray wreath of the feet of unborn pigs. And it was a hilarious, completely disgusting moment uh, for that to come out of the kitchen and for to land in front of David and everyone laughing and feeling disgusted at the same time. But it's only because he thought it was a mistranslation that he ever ordered it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Oh my goodness. And I mean, talking of abortion, which is not what I thought I'd be saying during this podcast, but I mean, there's so much packed into this novel that we haven't even mentioned: the pregnancy, the abortion, stealthing, and there's so many topics within shock induction. Although again, it's like I'm remiss not to mention them, but I also don't want to go into too much detail for fear of spoiling.
Yeah, the abortion, there is no abortion, but thank God. But it
Yeah.
is a device for forcing Samantha to put something greater at stake than her own talent. Um, you have to constantly escalate what the stakes are in the book. And so, deep in the second act, we need to put something more at stake than just her own happiness.
Yeah. Yeah. And whilst there might not be an abortion, there's a great deal of uncertainty as to whether there might be. And so that creates a lot of escalating tension.
And in a way, to go take it back to horror, I've always loved Rosemary's Baby. And that's just a book I will study for the rest of my life. And so much of that book is about uh, kind of culturally coding the tragedy of thalidomide and how when women trusted their doctors and did exactly what they were told for the entire term of their pregnancy, only to have their hearts broken. And and also in Rosemary's Baby, there was a lot of kind of pressure uh, around abortion and about reproductive control, whether the mother should have it or whether the doctor should have it. And so, part of me will always be rewriting Rosemary's Baby in each of my books.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're coming up to the time that we have together today, but I want to ask a question we've got from one of our patrons, Robert Stahl. And this really takes it to horror because he says, your short story Guts is a masterclass in horror with its gruesome descriptions of what happens to the guy at the bottom of the pool. Can you give writers some pointers onto how they can create such intense descriptions in their own works?
Wow, you know, Guts would deserve its own 1 hour podcast. But the things that work in Guts, again, going back to Scarlett O'Hara, the one part that really hooks the reader is where the narrator sees what's happening and he thinks it's a sea serpent. Something white has come out of a sea serpent has been hiding in the drain of my parents' swimming pool, just waiting to eat me. And the reader recognizes this as the Scarlett O'Hara moment, where Scarlett says there's not going to be a war. And in Guts, the narrator is saying it's a sea serpent. And in that moment, the reader is more intelligent than the character who's having the experience. And so the reader is pulled in on that frustrating avocado level, where the reader recognizes the typo and feels superior to not just the character, but feels superior to the writer, because the reader suddenly sees the writer, me, demeaning myself as I present this story. I'm kind of casting aside my status and my dignity to tell this story. And so in a way, the reader is feeling very superior and very protective of me in a very human way. And that opens the reader up to be the vulnerable person. So it's a misdirection, forcing the reader to fix what the narrator is getting wrong. But at the same time, it opens the reader up to having to carry the full horror of what's happening. The horror occurs in the reader's mind in the same way that in Rosemary's Baby, we never see the baby. We look into the bassinet, we see Rosemary's expression of horror. We get this discordant music. Again, we're going to chaos in the moment. This discordant, screechy music in that moment, which is basically a trumpet. It is really ugly, ugly music. And we never see the baby. And in our mind, we have to fill in the blank. Same with Gwyneth Paltrow's head at the end of 7. Brad Pitt opens the box. He looks in the box. We get all this chaos going on around Brad Pitt. We get his reaction. We never see Gwyneth's head in the box. And so in Guts, we cannot simply say, my bowels are prolapsing into the drain of the swimming pool. We have to describe it in a wrong way so that the reader makes that ultimate connection. And the reader is forced to carry the horror of that realization before it's overtly stated. And the reader is forced to carry that horror for maybe half a page, maybe a full page before it's confirmed. And by then, pretty much every reader is going to realize what's taking place before the narrator does. And it's in that moment, again, the Scarlett O'Hara moment, where the reader realizes the truth before the narrator does, that the real horror occurs. And that's where people start fainting.
Well, that is one hell of a note for us to go out on, and it has been a tremendous pleasure, as it always is, chatting with you. So thank you very much. And I wonder, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners and viewers?
You know, more and more, I see every short story and every book as an experiment. And it has to be an experiment on every level. It has to be a way of reinventing long-form prose, not just telling the story you're telling, but reinventing the language entirely to support that story and hoping that it works as an experiment. And I deeply, deeply appreciate the fact that people buy enough of my work that each time I make enough money that I can go back and do another experiment. Because I really am living from experiment to experiment. And it's only the income that I get from the books that allows me the time to write another book, to make another experiment. And if I didn't have that income, then I would be back to working at the post office or Freightliner. And so I do appreciate the support to doing yet another experiment.